We are Myth Vision. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. Today, we're battling the gods. I hope you guys stay tuned and enjoy this video. Look, ladies and gentlemen, it's been one of my passions lately to discover natural explanations for the divine. Are there really natural explanations that better suit the superstitious ideas that we've been carrying for thousands of years? Who knows how far back into prehistory we were superstitious in thinking these ideas? We might have evolved from the previous species thinking these kind of ideas, for all I know. I'm just saying that to say, the question is, were there atheists in the ancient world? And today we're going to be talking about the book Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Ancient World with Tim Whitmarsh. Now, of course, that's Dr. Tim Whitmarsh. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks for having me, Derek. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I'm super glad you got to jump on, because not only are we going to stir a little controversy up today, I think we're going to correct some errors with your expertise in pointing out some simple, basic information. And one of those flaws, I want to say up front to give a tease, is that atheism started with Christianity, that somehow atheism is it originated because of Christianity, and that the original Christians were accused of atheism. Therefore, atheism doesn't mean what you think it does by the modern sense. So this is a new, in the past 300 years, 200 years, maybe, a new idea of what atheism is actually meaning. And we're going to talk about ancient atheism prior to Christianity. So that's going to be right there. It's like, uh-oh, somebody hold on tight. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce Professor Tim Whitmarsh. He's a classicist, and correct me if I'm wrong on some of this stuff. I might butcher some words, and Greek words sometimes are very difficult to pronounce. So he's a classicist and the second AG Leventis. Did I say that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Leventis Professor of Greek Culture at the University of Cambridge. He is best known for his work on the Greek literary culture of the Roman Empire, especially the Second Sophistic and the Ancient Greek novel. Among his publications are, and the links will be in the description, you guys, make sure you guys go get a copy of all of them, but especially the book we're going to talk about today so you guys can catch up on this latest argument. Greek Literature and the Roman Empire, The Politics of Imitation. He wrote that in 2001. Ancient Greek Literature in 2004. The Second Sophistic, 2005. Narrative and Identity in the Ancient Greek Novel, Returning Romance, 2011. Beyond the Second Sophistic, Adventures in Greek Post-Classicism, 2013. Dirty Love, The Genealogy of the Ancient Greek Novel, 2018. And the book we're going to discuss today, Battling the Gods, Atheism, in the Ancient World. And that's a publication in 2016. So I'll start off with a question to you, Professor. What is myth? Since my show is called Myth Vision, we should probably take a second to establish what it means by myth and mythology with respect to the Greco-Roman literature. And I'd like to open with a quote from Plato's Republic, Book 2, 276e to 376a, if you don't mind. Socrates says, and there are two kinds of story, logia, true ones and fictional. Adamantus, am I saying that correct?
Yeah, close enough.
Adamantus says, yes. Socrates, we must educate them in both kinds, but in fiction first, mustn't we? Adamantus says, I don't understand. He said, what do you mean? Socrates says, do you understand, I said, that we tell children myths first? I assume this means fiction on the whole, but there can be truth in this too. And we use myths with children before we go on to physical exercise. And so in this example, the mythos in the sense of fictional fables or fairy tales. So if we're talking about myths of the Greco-Roman mythology, did the common people believe their myths in the same sense that practitioners of modern religions believe that the narratives of their own religious texts are literal? Like literally true? Sorry.
That's a really good question. There's actually a book called Did the Greeks Believe Their Myths by the French scholar Paul Veyne. And his answer is, as you would expect, it's complicated. It goes something like this. The word mythos, from which we get the English myth, has a myriad different meanings in Greek antiquity. It can mean just the plot of a story, whether that story is true or not. It can mean myth in the sense that we understand it. That's to say, a sort of a legendary tale, which is part of the folk mythology of a people. or it can mean something close to fiction in the way that we use it, the word today. Now, the Greeks did have a concept of fiction. They knew, of course, that stories could be factual or they could be made up, but they didn't really have a sharp distinction of the kind that we make. So when you walk into a bookstore, you see the fiction section and the non-fiction section, and they didn't really categorize stuff like that. So there was lots of gray area material. And I think the myths that we tend to think of as Greek myths, the Trojan War and so forth, most people would put in that gray area between the fictional and the non-fictional. They would think of this stuff as rooted in a kind of historical truth, but adorned with elements that are fictional. So people often say things like in Homer's Iliad, when gods appear and they pluck people out off and they sort of make them, or they cast mist around the place, whatever, all that supernatural stuff. I think many Greeks would say, well, that's just, poetic fantasy or poetic flights of fantasy that are superimposed onto a basically true historical myth.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, it sounds to me that a lot let me use it for example, that the Catholic Church is taking this approach, at least in terms of the Hebrew Bible, because you can see early church fathers, oftentimes they don't necessarily equate the Hebrew or Old Testament to being mythology or allegory or something. They might say certain parts might be depending on the church father, but overall they believed a lot of these narratives. And today the Catholic Church, these priests that are going around and saying, yeah, Adam and Eve mythology, Noah mythology, Jesus, hold on, he rose from the dead, buddy. So I guess the question then is, did they believe these myths in the same way? And I hear that in that vein before we move on, because I have to stick to this sheet. Okay, this is just such a great, you have so much information, I would sidetrack easily. So I want to make this last comment on this, and I think I'd love to have your response on this, is there are people who are building ideas off of this, suggesting, well, no, they didn't believe Poseidon really controlled the oceans, and, Zeus is up there throwing lightning bolts down. Are you sure? I mean, that's like saying for Christians that are trying to correct or fix or protect their text, they might run into stuff like Matthew 28, where these zombies come out of the graves. That's allegory. Oh, now you want to protect your literary device here and say, oh, that's allegory, because it's so absurd. Now, according to our eyes today, Mike Licona did this. That's allegory. He's a Christian apologist. And other Christian apologists that are coming more scholarship are accepting more stuff that's, let's say, was believed by Christians for a long time. So I suspect, and this is just me, that it's more complicated. Would you be able to clarify on that maybe some people did actually believe behind the natural phenomena there really were divine figures doing these things? Or
I think that's true. I mean, we have to be careful with the language of belief, which is, at one level, it's very Christian. I mean, it's only the Christians that say, I believe in one God, who make the profession of faith and belief a central tenet of, religious experience. Jews, Muslims, Hindus don't have quite the same investment in the idea of belief. But I think it's fair to ask the question, did people think this stuff was true, and what did they actually envisage when they thought a thunderbolt is sent by Zeus? Did they think that there really is an anthropomorphic figure who throws these things down, or did they think of it as more like sort of Wizard of Oz like figure sort of controlling the buttons or whatever? All of these are legitimate questions. Of course, we can't go back and interview ancient Greeks and stuff. We've only got the traces that we have, which are quite plentiful and quite rich, but they're not people's innermost thoughts. What I would say is that that we do see evidence for people saying the traditional conceptions of divine influence on nature and the weather, for example, are naive, and you shouldn't believe in that sort of stuff anymore. And that sort of suggests that there were people that did believe in this stuff.
Yeah.
And that people, I mean, the human brain is an extraordinary thing. We tend to be very generous toward people throughout history, and we say, everyone at all points must have been rational, and they must have taken decisions for rational reasons, and everything must be explicable. But we sort of forget that an awful lot of people live their lives, and all of us live our lives using emotion and general beliefs in the world as sort of shortcuts, because we can't rationally process everything because there's too much material coming at us. So we use these sort of cognitive shortcuts, like, as I say, deeply held beliefs that have never been interrogated, emotions, and so forth, as I say, sort of to accelerate through our decision-making processes on a daily basis and to cope with the awfulness of existence.
That's true. Yeah. And I have to say, once again, shameless plug, go in the description, get Battling the Gods. You go into a great depth of the literature, and I love your opening, the debate, the hypothetical debate. I really enjoy that, because I thought this was real quoting at first. This is somebody, who hasn't read Greek literature like that. I'm ignorant on this. I have to learn. I'm learning. I admit that I'm ignorant and I have a lot to learn, but I listened to your opening and I thought, this is a debate from like 5-6 centuries BC. And but it sounded so well put together, like that I could imagine that really would be a discussion between two guys. The problem is trials like Socrates and the accusations for people who would take a position like that. I suspect it wasn't publicly accepted. There could have been an easily, it wasn't necessarily burn them at the stakes, like Christian church might have done later on if you weren't a Trinity believer or something. But it definitely wasn't socially acceptable in the broader sense, I suspect, which is why your job was very difficult, trying to dig in and find and extrapolate, certain clear atheists that existed in history.
Yeah, the word atheist, or atheos is the Greek word, is almost always negative in the Greek world. It's an insult thrown at someone else. And I mean, I think by and large, it was a world that was tolerant of a wide variety of beliefs about the gods, including that they didn't exist at all, because it's a world without scripture. I mean, Greek religion doesn't have a text which tells you how to believe in the gods. The closest they have is the Iliad and the Odyssey, the works of Homer, which were held in a kind of reverence and awe, but they're not really theological texts. They're not, and a lot of people held very orthodox views about gods, but would have said that the gods of Homer and Hesiod are sort of made up kind of fictional mythical stuff in the way that we were talking about earlier. So yeah, as I say, I think there is a kind of flexibility and a capacity to Greeks' general approach to divinity. But as you say, there were times when the repressive hammer came down, and one of those times was around 430 BCE, when the Athenians were. I mean, it's the beginning of the Peloponnesian War with Sparta, which must be part of the context here, because it's a sort of crisis time, going to war with your big rivals. Around this time, also there is a plague in Athens which kills a lot of people. So, they are. Athens is both a sort of honeypot attracting all of the intellectuals across the Greek world. It's the biggest city in the Mediterranean, incredibly wealthy and incredibly open to experimental new ideas. So it's a place where atheistic ideas are fermenting, but at the same time, it's a place of panic and a place where the more religiously conservative, it's slightly anachronistic terms, but the more religiously conservative are thinking we need all of the divine muscle on our side that we can get, and therefore we can't have these atheists going around professing heretical beliefs about things because we need the gods on our side. So you've got this sort of weird tension between the two in Athens, and that creates a kind of perfect storm that leads to the prosecution of Anaxagoras.
We could apply that today in modern day America, actually. There's so many religious fundamentalists that are Christian. And, many people like me who are now skeptical and come out saying, hey, I'm an atheist now, and I once was a Christian. And well, if we went to war or a natural disaster comes, they're going to blame us. So that's just a perfect example, so to speak, of the blaming is on those who aren't. The Jews did the same thing. Why are we being punished? Why are we being captured? it's not that our God doesn't exist. It's not that God's not being faithful. One of you guys didn't keep Sabbath last week. What's going on? You know? So, yeah. I'll move on to the sheet if that's fine.
Yeah.
So, theistic atheism. You mentioned in the book that the Greek term atheos, which we actually were just talking about, essentially meant godless in the sense of not being for or being favored by the gods, or being opposed to the gods. This is obviously very different from the ways we used atheist term in English. So I just want to read a couple examples of this kind of usage, and I'm going to butcher these names. I've literally practiced last night trying to figure out how to say this. So it's Aeschylus.
Eastless, yeah.
Eastless, okay. And then Eumenides 151. The Furies addressing the god Apollo. O child of Zeus, you have become a thief. You, a youth, have ridden down old divinities by showing respect to your suppliant, a godless atheos, man and cruel to a parent. Although you are a god, you have stolen away a man that killed his mother. Here, is Aeschylus the same as Orestes?
No, Orestes and Aeschylus is the author.
Orestes.
Yeah.
Okay. Here, Orestes is said to be godless because he's not the god's favor or in the god's favor, not because he's an atheist. And then we have basically the only occurrence of the term atheos in the entire New Testament. So it's probably worth mentioning Paul, or pseudo-Paul, in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12. Remember that you were at the time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God, atheist, if you will, in the world. Obviously, the Ephesians did believe in gods prior to their conversion to Christianity, but they were without the monotheistic uppercase God of Israel. But when you contrast that with one of Paul's authentic letters, 1 Corinthians 8:4, you get a statement like this: there is no God but one. Before we get into the key examples of atheism, so if you don't mind being used in the modern sense, atheos, of philosophical atheism, can you comment on how the term was understood before that particular development? So I guess there's a lot to unpack right there, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, so the example that you took there was from a Greek tragedy, and Greek tragedy is it's constitutively about people being sort of alienated from their environments and isolated, and people in extreme positions of desperation. So there are a lot of negative words in tragedy, to put it mildly. And atheos is a negative word because it means without. That's what the a bit means, without a god. So we often find people described as, in effect, abandoned by the gods, God-forsaken, despised by the gods, in the same way as they might be despised by humanity. People in tragedies often say things like, I'm like a rock out at sea, battered by the waves, in isolation. I've got no support networks. I'm just me on my own. So that's the kind of tragic vibe, if you like, and that's why the word atheos is used in that way in tragedy. Now, I reckon by about 411, we have a clear attestation in a play by Aristophanes of the use of the word atheos in something like the modern sense. But the first unambiguous usage is in the trial of Socrates in 399 BC, where Socrates very clearly uses, at least in Plato's account of this trial, which is written 10 years or so later, we very clearly, Socrates understands the word atheos to mean a philosophical commitment to the principle that there are no gods. So it goes on a journey in the course of the 5th century from that sort of poetic usage, of tragic usage, to a more philosophical usage. But there's always a kind of grey area between the two. It's not a word that is used with pinpoint precision. It's a broadly emotive word. And as I said earlier, it's used primarily negatively to stigmatize people. There are other phrases also that are used to indicate what we would call atheism. So not people talk about not believing in the gods, for example, those who don't believe in the gods, which is a sort of set phrase that is used that recurs periodically. And what you were also mentioning, early Christians, and even before that, Philo of Alexandria, who's a Jewish writer, is using the word atheos in that sense as well, which is of being someone who doesn't believe in one's own God. So, as you say, for Jews and Christians, to be an atheist doesn't mean to lack any belief in gods. It means to lack belief in the correct God.
The God that they might be ethnically attached to, or their own city-state divinity or something like that could be the case. Yeah, I think we're going to touch on just a little bit of that as we go more, but I really appreciate you doing that, because what I'm finding is that the term takes on various meaning. Depending on the context, that term has various meanings, and it doesn't mean, like when you hear the word atheos, it doesn't mean, all right, these guys are all believers in the non-existence of God or the lacking belief in a God. No, it could simply mean they don't believe in their God, that they were, let's say they're Athenians, and they become a Christian, or, something like that. They're just not believing their original God. And that could be they're without their God. Or I thought was interesting in your book, I'll make a comment on how you said, it sounds apologetic, like a weird, it's like an old way of thinking, like they're arguing, and none of them accept for a moment that the gods don't exist. So they'll say stuff like, well, I know that, the way you're treated in life, whoever the guy might be, that's evidence that the gods are disfavoring you. And it's like that they use that as arguments to say, like, that means
that's a comedy. So that's a joke, basically. But yes, that there are two slaves. One of them says, by Zeus. The other one goes, what do you mean by Zeus? You don't believe in that old kind of nonsense, do you? And the other one says, yes, of course I believe in the gods, because why is it that I'm so God-forsaken if no gods exist? So yeah, I mean, it's a joke, basically.
That's so funny, though. I even though it's a joke, I think it's kind of funny, because you would think that would make you question, like today, if things are just going bad. But no, people turn to books like Job and they're like, this is evidence that God's testing me. And it's like, dude. So I do appreciate your book. I keep plugging it. I want everybody to go read it because it's really, really good. Let's dispel the myths about ancient atheism, if you don't mind. And I'm going to play a couple little clips. One of them I actually created with my friend Steven. So huge shout out to my friend Steven Nelson for putting all this stuff together, including writing this stuff. I'm butchering some of these words. He would have been able to run them off easily. He reads and understands Greek and stuff. So he really admires you for what you do. There's been a lot of debate online in the last few years over the definition of atheist and atheism. I'm sure you're aware of it too. Before we get too deep into that, I just want to get your professional opinion on a couple of things. I'm going to play a soundbite from a well-known atheist who goes by Osmodeus Ramesses II, or Ozzy for short. Here he discusses the ancient use of the term atheos. And I'm going to go ahead and play this here. I want to get you, maybe, if you don't mind, give us your 2 cents on this. Let me get this open here. Can you hear that?
Just about, yeah.
The allegation is that Socrates has been spreading impieties, falsehoods about the gods. Not that he didn't believe in the gods necessarily, but that he spread falsehoods and was corrupting the youth.
Okay.
So it's entirely unclear exactly how they understood it. We have some idea, but it certainly wasn't what we mean by it and what it came to mean for the last few centuries.
I don't know if you caught that, what he's actually trying to say. If you want, I could play it back.
I think I caught it. So he was talking about the accusation against Socrates, saying it wasn't an accusation against him for being an atheist, as we would understand it. Is that right?
Right. And I think, isn't his name Miletus, the man on trial that's put him on trial? He's suggesting that he is an atheist, but this guy's saying no. They're just talking about impiety. But it's not, this is no modern concept being accusing Socrates of believing in no gods at all, like we would think atheism means. Can you correct that? Or is this guy correct, or is he wrong?
Well, I think he's right up to a point that the accusation against Socrates wasn't an accusation. He wasn't being tried for atheism. He's being tried for not believing in the Greek is kind of weird here. not it's either believing or worshipping the gods of the city and introducing new gods and corrupting the youth. So it's three elements, the first two of which are religious and the third of which is to do with corrupting the youth, which may also mean corrupting them by teaching them false ideas about the gods. We don't have much information on that. So yeah, I mean, it was a very broad brush accusation in line with a lot of accusations in Athenian law, because they didn't have specialist jurors, they didn't have statute books with which defined laws in a kind of crystalline sense as the Romans did. It was basically, because it was a democracy, the idea was that laws should be applied in accordance with the broad general understanding of the populace as a whole, rather than being in the province of specialist professional lawyers. So yes, it was a broad, vague accusation. The thing is that it does seem to echo the accusation against Anaxagoras that I mentioned earlier. That was an accusation against him for not believing in gods or not worshipping gods, this very difficult phrase. And as the speaker correctly said, Melitus, the prosecutor, does at one point, at least in Plato's version of it, does at one point seem to imply that the accusation includes the component of not believing in the gods at all, of having no commitment to the belief in the gods. So I think the accusation itself is very broad, but it could include, and if Plato is right, did include the accusation of not believing in the gods.
That's what I was trying to, I think, wrap my head around, and I could be mistaken, but from watching that little clip, that seems to be his point. Is he's divorcing any modern concept in that discussion there. And he's on a show with another guy, Steve McRae, who also thinks that the idea of atheism actually originated with the Christians. Yeah. And you're going to see a clip here in a minute. I'll show you that as well. But the point is they're trying to say that there was no mention of any modern atheism in that discussion at all. Whereas you just mentioned that there is a point to someone who most likely, at least it appears, is a all-out atheist, someone who may be potentially an all-out atheist. And that's going on well before Christianity's on the scene. So
well, that's almost a quote from what Socrates says in reply to the accusation. He says, "Do you think I'm an out-and-out atheist? Do you think I think that there are no gods?" So, I mean, it's very clear that in that particular passage, what Socrates understands the accusation to be is that he doesn't believe in the existence of gods at all. And we have another text by Xenophon which defends Socrates against the charge of not believing in gods. So it is wrong to say that there is no concept of disbelief in the gods before Christianity. On the other hand, I mean, if you want to say the modern idea of atheism is distinctively modern, a post-Enlightenment concept, I mean, that is true as well, because, I mean, the shape that atheism has taken in the last 200 years is quite distinctive to scientific modernity and to a world that believes in, or at least, this sort of Enlightenment view that we're moving inexorably towards a more rational scientific conception of the world, and that is going to lead to people rejecting any belief in divinity, and that's a road that we're set on irreversibly. That's not an ancient idea at all. So there's an element of truth to the idea that atheism, as we understand it now, is definitively modern. But I would reject the idea that people didn't believe in that. You can't find people that reject the existence of divinity before Christianity.
Your book goes into great length showing that, actually.
Well,
and,
yes.
It ciphers through, though. You clearly show some complicated situations to try and explain what's going on, including the Socrates trial type stuff, and show look, it's not one size fits all. There's various complex concepts and ideas. But, I get a lot of people who talk about science. Oh, the ancients had all these inventions like modern science. And, I've had Tim O'Neill recently come on, and Tim O'Neill talks about the myth of the burning of the Alexandrian library, which was supposedly burned by Christians. And he says, no, it wasn't burned by Christians. And he goes into the history behind it. It's been burned multiple times. Obviously, there was a once for all type scenario that ends up at the end in like 3rd, 4th century AD. But his point was that, the sciences then were more philosophical and they weren't necessarily like what we think in science. So, yeah, I can see there being an evolved version of something that's already laying the groundwork here back in the day. So yeah, I pulled that video context out, and he was claiming the term atheos was used against Socrates in a sense of impiety, meaning that he taught falsehoods about the gods, not that he didn't believe they existed. Now, before you elucidate the example from Plato's Apology 26, I'd like to provide the actual quote and context for the audience. And rather than read it, I've actually cut together a video to illustrate it even better. And this video clip of the scene will be performed along with some dialogue from an audiobook that has a good translation, if you don't mind. And that's actually something that I did recently. And my buddy Steven Nelson was like, this is awesome. It does the job. So I'm going to open this link here and share this with you. We kind of already talked about this, but I do want you to maybe give me your thoughts on the clip, maybe. I don't know. See if you like it.
But still, I should like to know, Meletus, in what I am affirmed to corrupt the young. I suppose you mean, as I infer from your indictment, that I teach them not to acknowledge the gods, which the state acknowledges, but some other new divinities or spiritual agencies in their stead. These are the lessons by which I corrupt the youth, as you say? Yes, that I say emphatically. Then, by the gods, Meletus, of whom we are speaking, tell me and the court, in somewhat plainer terms, what you mean. For I do not as yet understand whether you affirm that I teach other men to acknowledge some gods, and therefore that I do believe in gods, and am not an entire atheist. This you do not lay to my charge, but only you say that they are not the same gods which the city recognizes. The charge is that they are different gods. Or do you mean that I am an atheist, simply, and a teacher of atheism? I mean the latter, that you are a complete atheist. What an extraordinary statement. Why do you think so, Meletus? Do you mean that I do not believe in the godhead of the sun or moon, like other men? I assure you, judges, that he does not, for he says that the sun is stone, and the moon earth. Friend Meletus, you think that you are accusing Anaxagoras, and you have but a bad opinion of the judges if you fancy them illiterate to such a degree as not to know that these doctrines are found in the books of Anaxagoras, the Clazomenian, which are full of them. And so, forsooth, the youth are said to be taught them by Socrates, when there are not unfrequently exhibitions of them at the theatre. And they might pay their money and laugh at Socrates if he pretends to father these extraordinary views. And so, Meletus, you really think that I do not believe in any god? I swear by Zeus that you believe absolutely in none at all.
There's a little... Was that cool?
Yeah, magic. How'd you do it?
It took me about 20 minutes, but he came up with the audio, and he said that the obvious way that the reader's reading that is a very good translation. The way that he's defining it, it makes the point pretty clear. We know Socrates wasn't an all-out atheist, but isn't that the accusation? It's not just impiety. Don't get me wrong. Of course, impiety is the charge, but is the accuser falsely accusing Socrates of being an all-out atheist? That's the question.
At that point, yeah, I think he is. Yeah, absolutely.
It sounds that way, and I just wanted to get you to maybe clarify that. So, yeah, he says, please enlighten us here. When Plato writes, I do not believe in any god, in the Greek, I cannot even begin to read it out in Greek. What exactly does he mean? Is that consistent with the modern sense of atheism, or does it refer to some form of impiety towards gods that are believed to exist? Could it be the same? Could they have placed impiety along with the idea of not believing in any gods, and therefore but is it a modern conception somewhat of the idea that no gods are believed at all?
I think it's absolutely unambiguous in Plato that we're talking about a question of belief in the existence of God, and that is what Meletus is accusing Socrates of doing, of not believing in the existence of any gods whatsoever. There's no other way of reading it.
Yeah. Thank you for like having you, an expert classicist professor, say that. It like cuts through a lot of BS with a hot knife through butter. Roman persecution of atheists. So this is going to get back into the Christian situation here for a moment. One of the very vocal critics of the supposed misuse of the term atheism is someone named Steve McCrae. Have you ever heard of him?
No.
Okay. Well, that's even better then. Who identifies as an agnostic. He has been engaged in many debates over the years, including an ongoing dialogue with Dr. Richard Carrier, who summed up everything in a blog post, which I'll link in the description for any of you guys who want to read it and understand where he's coming from. We can get into the weeds of that issue later if you'd like, but I just want to play a short clip from one of his debates where Steve McCrae tries to school his opponent on what he claims is the original use of the term atheos. And I'd like to get your feedback on this popular claim. I guess this is something that's floating around in Christian apologetics. And I don't know if this is Christian apologetics or if this is just a total mistake on his part.
And what atheism meant.
What was the original use of atheism or of an atheist?
I don't remember what the original use of atheism, but what I'm
It was
trying
for
to
Christians.
Church.
Christians were atheist.
The church wants atheism.
No, listen to me very carefully. The original use of atheos, was to refer to Christians that didn't accept Roman pantheon gods.
Okay.
Okay, so they believed a God exists, but they were called atheists because they were, quote, without gods, as people bring up the etymology. But etymological concerns are not how the words are used in modernity. So even though etymologically, yes, it is without gods, and it is true that all atheists are without gods, but so are other positions that are non-atheist, right? Agnostic is without gods, and agnostic is not atheism. But these words, like you said, do change, right? I have no problem with the words changing. Right. But for the last 300 years, this is how the word is accepted to be in the philosophical literature. And what you're saying is not just, I think it should be used differently, like Flew argues. You're making a value judgment and say it's used incorrectly.
Right. I mean, if I think...
Okay, so there's enough. I don't have to give you much more. What do you think of that?
Well, I think... to go back to a point that we made earlier, there is a grain of truth there, in that the word atheist clearly, is used in different ways in different contexts, and we do have a very distinctive concept of what atheism is now. And as I say, it's attached very closely to the idea of scientific post-Enlightenment modernity. So it's kind of true that when he makes the point that the original etymological usage of the word in Greek doesn't necessarily tell us about how we should use the word now. I mean, it's perfectly permissible for cultures to redefine words, and they do this the whole time. I mean, it's the same as, the word technique, for example, comes from a Greek word, which means something completely different in Greek antiquity. So I accept that point, but he's wrong in saying that the original usage was to attack Christians. That is a usage, but that's not the earliest attested usage. We've just been talking about this. The word is actually much older than that. It goes back to the 5th century BCE. And the other point that I would just pause on is that this claim that the word is used by the Romans to attack the Christians is actually only found in Christian literature. So one reading of that, and this is a claim that I've made, I'm not absolutely sure whether I agree with it still, but I mean, it's basically a Christian idea. This idea that, again, we mentioned this earlier, that to be an atheist, this idea that you define atheist in such a way as to exclude people who have the wrong conception of divinity, not people who don't believe in gods. I think that is basically a Judeo-Christian spin. And it's once you get the idea of monotheism, which is a very distinctive and very unusual in the ancient world form of belief, that's when you get the idea that if you don't believe in my God, you're getting it wrong, that you're not believing in the existence of God at all. This slide is helped by the fact that the word God, the name God, in Judeo-Christian Greek is theos. So atheos means literally without theos, which if you're a Jew or Christian means the one God. So as I say, I mean, there's very scant evidence to suggest that Romans themselves thought of Christians as atheists outside of Christian literature.
Do you think that that's that the Christian literature, because really this can go into some of the discussions of like martyrdom, Polycarp, Justin Martyr, Eusebius, Clement of Alexandria. Let me just read this. You point out in the book that the idea comes primarily from early Christian sources, like you're talking about here, martyrdom of Polycarp, Justin Martyr, Eusebius, Clement of Alexandria, and also you mentioned the non-Christian sources for this information are lacking key details. And so let me read this, and then I'd like to make a quick comment, and of course, get your expert opinion on this. Cassius Dio mentions that some people who were drifting into Jewish ways were charged with atheism, but an earlier account of this same event in Suetonius merely mentions that taxes were levied against some Jews. Might these references to Jews in Cassius Dio actually be a reference to Christians? If so, would the charge of atheism have been due merely to their impiety towards Roman gods?
Yes, so Cassius Dio is 3rd century CE or AD, if you prefer, so relatively late. So it's possible that by that stage, Christian conceptions of atheism were leaking into non-Christian material. Your question was whether these accusations of atheism, if they did take place against Jews and Christians, whether they were to do with non-performance of Roman ritual. And the answer is yes. I mean, it's absolutely clear that the biggest problem the Romans had with Christians was Christians' refusal to sacrifice to the emperor. It's a very distinctive form of imperial management that the Romans use. They get everyone in all the cities to make sacrifices and offerings to the emperors. And this is the importance of this is reaffirmed in the mid-3rd century under an emperor called Decius, and that the people are supposed to have a certificate saying that they agree that, I sign here, I, Derek Lambert, agree to sacrifice to the emperor, and Christians wouldn't sign these certificates and they wouldn't own these certificates.
Interesting.
So, a sort of pushback against Christians, not for being Christians, but for refusing to sacrifice to the emperor.
Is it possible to, just throwing this out there, on the atheos, the atheist idea, the accusation, the negative accusation on them, had to do with their monotheism? And of course, what you're suggesting here, yes, it does. But what I mean is there's henotheism and then there's monotheism. And monotheism, by its very definition, strict monotheism forces every other god to be non-existent. And therefore, there's only one God, which means you're saying these gods don't exist. You're in a sense an atheist to their gods, which makes them go, you don't believe in God. Even though you do believe in a God. And the problem with it is also, I suspect, that there were no idols, no images. So now you're like, there's nothing, you have nothing you're worshiping. So the accusation goes full-fledged, saying you not only don't have images, you have nothing that, represents your God. You're also saying nobody else's God exists but your God, and your God doesn't even have any visibility. So how the heck, I suspect that there's probably that thrown at them. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, Christians aren't so insistent on the idea that God shouldn't be represented, or at least Jesus shouldn't be represented, as Jews are. So, there is early Christian art and there are early Christian depictions of Jesus. But you're right that by and large, the conception of God that Christians have, it's not unparalleled in the Greco-Roman world, because, the earliest philosophers had these ideas of as a remote, abstract, transcendent deity who's not depicted in sculptures and so forth. But I mean, that's not the conventional Greco-Roman view. The point that you make is absolutely right, that temples and statues and the visibility of gods and their homes is absolutely critical to Greco-Roman religion, because it is basically a sort of collection of local religions. It's to be performed by members of a city in a particular temple at a certain time, because that's where the god lives and that's where you believe the god to live. And the statue, in a sense, sort of embodies the god. I mean, it's not, they didn't think the statues were the gods quite, but the statue does represent in a more than just symbolic way, represents the god. So I think you're right that a lot of Greeks and Romans would have struggled to get their head around this radically different conception of divinity that Christianity in particular was was pushing around the world.
Yeah,
But,
I just
sorry, just to finish on this, I mean, I think
please.
there is a way in which the Christian belief in a transcendent God was actually quite attractive to a lot of Greeks and Romans. I mean, clearly people were converting to Christianity, and I think that this is to do with the, if you live in an empire, you are, you know, your sense of allegiance, the sense of the political unit that you belong to, is no longer just your city. So some of that force of local polis religion is broken down, and you start believing in a more distant, remote form of political power embodied in the figure of the emperor. And I think that facilitates a belief in the religious sphere in a remote, transcendent deity. So it's not quite as if, I mean, it's not as if Christianity and Greco-Roman ideas are sort of poles apart. There are ways, you know, they're quite compatible, and that, I think, is the explanation for the spread of Christianity, really.
Yeah, I could see that being not to prove anything about why they're being called atheists, but I could see it not working in their favor, that they're not running around with idols, you know, and such, or at least they weren't supposed to. Let's see, the concept of sin and paganism, because this ties into what you're talking about in an emperor type situation. So there's going to be a crossbreed of culture here. Here's the following quote from the page 46 of Battling the Gods. Jealousy of the divine privilege was not sinful. Early Greece had only a weak idea of what was sinful, quote unquote sinful, because there were no God-sent commandments to break. The Greek translators of the Bible had to adapt a rare word, and I'm going to try and pronounce this, aliterios, Aliteros, to express this fundamentally alien idea. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you mean there is that the Greek translators of the Hebrew Bible adapted the pagan idea of sin, using the Greek term I cannot pronounce, into the Hebrew idea of failure or missing the mark. Is that true?
Yeah. So the point I was making there was that when the Greek translators of the Hebrew Bible came across the Jewish Israelite idea of sin, rather than using, you know, a word like crime or bad thing or something like that, they took a relatively rare Greek word to indicate, I think, that this is a relatively un-Greek idea, the idea of sin. So you need a new word. It's not an entirely new word, but it's a fairly sort of obscure word. It's not super obscure, but it's, you know, it's not part of the central moral Greek moral lexicon. And what I mean by this idea that the Greeks, the pre-Jewish Greeks, didn't have an idea of sin, is not that they didn't have an idea that certain things are wrong or that certain things are displeasing to the gods, but it's this particular Judeo-Christian, or let's say Christian, idea of, you know, there being a categorical opposition between good and bad that is sort of locked into the metaphysical structure of the cosmos. Greek gods typically, or most importantly, Greek gods don't behave in morally proper ways all the time.
Right.
You know, anyone who's read any Homer, you know, the Iliad and everything, you know that gods can be jealous, they can commit adultery, they can fight with each other, they're not always on the same side, you know, they can scheme against each other's backs, all this sort of stuff. So yeah, the idea that gods go around sort of demanding a kind of moral standard of humans all the time, and that people would be consigned to eternal damnation if they don't meet those standards. This is really a Christian idea, although you can see, you know, traces of it in the Greek world, if you like. If you squint at it, you could say, well, this looks a little bit like the Christian conception of hell. This looks a little bit like the Christian conception of sin. But by and large, that's not how Greek religion worked. Greek religion wasn't about doing morally right things. It was about doing the things or performing the sacrifices that the gods demanded in the right way, in the right place, at the right time. It was about keeping to the ritual calendar.
Interesting. Okay. Can you also elaborate on the Greeks having a weak idea of sin? Like, do you think the idea was close to some sense of karma or divine reciprocacy? Sorry, I always say that wrong. Like the curse that Tantalus brought on vows of Atreus, and I think I'm saying that correct there. But you know, I saw an interesting connection. I don't know if you've ever heard of Dennis R. MacDonald. He taps into the Homeric Iliad, Euripides the Bacchae. He loves the epics, but he's also a New Testament scholar, PhD in the field. And he's done this thing called mimesis criticism, and it kind of ties into this. Maybe get your thoughts. This is an interesting thing. I love his book. I put it back up right here. So this is just the fourth gospel book, the Dionysian Gospel. And he says the first layer of the Gospel of John, whoever the author was, is making Jesus better than Dionysus. And I was like, I like this. But then he talks about that story about Lazarus and the rich man. And the rich man is like, please just touch your tongue, the water, and I'm so thirsty. Well, Tantalus has this same scene where he's tantalizing. We get the term from, and he can't drink the water. And he shows that the gospel authors take the liberty of borrowing from Homeric epics, Euripides the Bacchae, and make Jesus better than Dionysus and stuff. And I love that kind of stuff. So I guess in that vein, I'm rabbit trailing a little bit. What are your thoughts of that? Do you think that there's a bridge that's taking place here? They're trying to bridge over and combine Greek idea with Jewish in a sense?
Well, this idea that there is something Dionysus-like about Jesus goes back to antiquity itself. In fact, actually, just this afternoon, it's the afternoon here, I was reading Greek for a late Greek epic poet called Nonnus, who wrote 48 books on the adventures of Dionysus, but also wrote 21 books on which were of retelling the story of the Gospel of John. So he's a poet who writes Greek epic stuff and uses the same language to describe Jesus in John and Dionysus. Not exactly the same, obviously they're different kinds of figures, but there are all sorts of crossovers between the two. There's a version, a late antique poem that takes bits of Euripides' play about Dionysus, rejigs them, and makes a story about Christ out of them. So it's clear that in antiquity, people were thinking that the story of Christ, in particular John's version of it, because of the wedding at Cana, which is the transformation of water into wine, which is the Dionysiac act, if you like, because Dionysus is the god of wine. All of these, people in antiquity were thinking about Christ as potentially a sort of Dionysiac figure. Now, it makes sense to think that the gospel writers who were trying to, or at least the later gospel writers who were trying to make the story of Jesus appeal to non-Christian Greeks, it makes sense to think of them as using sort of material that would have been familiar to potential non-Christian readers as a conversion strategy. I don't know. Having read the Gospel of John myself recently, I don't think it would have struck people as, on the surface, as very Dionysiac. It doesn't to me look. Jesus looks a rather different figure to Dionysus in that, but certainly at the deeper level, there may have been subconscious or resonances of Dionysus that would have engaged readers' subconsciouses as they were reading it.
Yeah, I think he argues there's 3 layers to John, and the second layer is the anti-Jewish gospel.
Yes.
And the third layer, he said, I can't remember exactly, but anyway, he says there's 3 layers. That means there's probably 3 redactors that were editing this. And then the first layer is the Dionysian layer, where he does an interesting thing in his book. He literally takes the prologue of Jesus, in the beginning was the Word and the Logos, and he shows that there is overlap in the Euripides Bacchae on Dionysus. The interesting thing in the parable about Lazarus being in Abraham's bosom, really weird. A man in a man's bosom, sounds very Dionysian in Zeus's bosom, where he's taking him to, he continues the birth of Dionysus after killing the wife. And I got to learn these names. So forgive me. I can't wait to know this stuff off the top of my head, but, maybe I will do a follow-up and I can have you, a classicist expert in the field of classicism, because I think you would have so much to say about this stuff. Like you have your head wrapped around this. This is like a second or almost like another language that you just know off the top of your head. And that's why I have you on here, is just learning from you. So much fun. But I'm getting off track. So let me mention one more thing on the sin. If the pagan notion of sin was so different from the Jewish doctrine, why were pagans compelled to convert to Christianity when their so-called sins were allegedly perpetrated against the God of Israel, a local ethnic deity of the Jewish people? That's a loaded question, and I know it's complicated. Like, why would these Greeks give a crap? They don't even have the same conception of sin. That's why I asked if whether or not the concept of sin that we hear in the New Testament is carrying more of some type of Hellenistic tendency, or if Hellenism itself caused the aroma in the air, so to speak, to allow these people to adopt these ideas. I wonder why. Why would they do this?
Well, I think we have to remember that there's a difference between classical Greeks and Greek speakers in the Roman Empire, because the classical Greeks that we're thinking about when we talk about Euripides, for example, who's a playwright in the late 5th century, that classical culture centered in Euripides' case on the city of Athens. We know quite a lot about that world, and we know that it's a democratic world. It's a world built around intellectual experimentalism. It's also a world of empire and slave owning and repression of women, and as I say, so we've got quite a rich idea of what Athens in the 5th century BCE looks like. Then the next phase is what we call the Hellenistic world, which is the world created by Alexander the Great, who conquers as far as northern India, down into North Africa, conquers Israel as well. And in that world, Greek speakers and people who, build Greek temples are spread over much of the known world, but that Greek culture is blended with lots of forms of local religion and thought and language and literature and so forth. So the people that were converting to Christianity weren't necessarily the people that we think of as classical Greeks. They could have been all sorts of people. And in fact, actually, there's some quite good evidence that a lot of the early converts were, in fact, Jews themselves. That they were the people to whom early Christians were appealing. So, yeah. I can't quite remember what your question was.
Yeah, no, I guess it's just the idea of the pagan influence to coming into Christianity with them preaching a concept of sin. I think we might be peeking behind the blinds a little on some of the evidence because it's so fragmentary to know what early Christianity really was. Do we rely and trust Paul's letters? What's Paul doing out here in Athens, for example, which that's in fictional Acts. The book of Acts is fiction. So was Paul even in Athens? I don't know. But nonetheless, it's like he's over here talking to Epicurus and others and things like that. Like, what are the odds that he's going to come with this God? I will say this. He has a strange conception of God if he is a practicing Jew, supposedly, who's teaching this stuff, because in his preaching in fictional Acts, which is late in the game, we know it's late. Men of Athens, listen, look here. God does not dwell in temples made by hands. Maybe that's a jab at the fact that the 70 AD temple's destruction took place probably at the same time. That's also very stoic. That's very God is this abstract beyond, and he set men in their boundaries and he's not far from any one of us. He's quoting pagan poets. It's like, come on. So that's probably fiction, and we might be influenced by that, by going back trying to figure out Paul. And Paul probably wasn't doing what Acts is saying he's doing. I don't know. That's the tough part about these scholars that trying to peek behind the blinds. But if Paul is talking to Gentiles and not Jews, what kind of message is that, to get these people interested? Are they probably obviously not very well off? But if they are very well off and they're educated, it sounds like he's greeting the house of Caesar and like Philippians and Romans. He's, hey, Epaphroditus. And, do we believe that really happened? And if we do, what kind of message is Paul teaching, and how would that be conceived by those people? You see, I know I'm asking you to read their minds, and maybe I should have called a witch or something. I'm just kidding. But do you have an opinion on this, even if it isn't backed up by expertise, just based on your information you've learned in the histories of this time?
Well, I think that you mentioned chronology. I think we do see a change over time. So I think, Mark, which is the earliest of the Gospels, is probably doing relatively little in terms of trying to use the language of non-Jewish Greek speakers. But by the time you get to Luke, then it's looking a lot more Greek. And by the time, Acts, as you say, has got a lot of people have detected in Acts, not just motifs, but even language, which is borrowed from the Greek literary tradition. And then by the time you get to the 2nd century, it's absolutely crystal clear that the people that we call the Christian apologists, that's to say Justin Martyr and Tatian and the like, are very well versed in Greek philosophy and are using Greek philosophical debating techniques in order to prove that Christianity is a superior form of philosophy on philosophical terms to anything that the pagan world can throw back at them. So yeah, I do think that Christianity is deeply suffused with pre-Christian Greek ideas, but I also think that is a process that increases over time. I see the earliest stratum of Christianity as not particularly Greek. I think it is, Jewish.
Yeah, messianic. It just does. Yeah, and how it went from that to what it, that, you know what I mean? Like that's a big, that's the $1 million question.
Yeah, and how much, to what extent it changed, and to what extent it was sort of bent out of all recognition by adaptation to the historical and cultural world of the Roman Empire. As you say, that's the $1 million question.
Well said.
Lots of Christians would believe that fundamentally. That there is it's sort of a deeply Protestant idea, isn't it? At one level, the idea that all of that accretion, basically, all of that barnacle-like stuff that goes on the surface after the 1st century is what needs to be cleared away, and getting back to the truth and the simplicity of Jesus' message is the prime aim of theology.
I think that, when we use the term initially of myth and we talk about fiction, stories, or is it just stories of potential historical events mythologized? There's so much layers to this. I think there is potentially some validity on suggesting to the Jew first, then to the Gentile. And that might be a motif that's applied to the New Testament, saying, look, initially, this was Jewish. Jews were the initial people who took this. But then as you see anti-Semitism really develop, even in early church, you see it transforming it, forcing it to be less Jewish. So you got guys going, look, we'll buy this and we'll probably fund this philosophy, but we aren't doing it as long as we're sitting here believing in the superstitions of Jews, or they try to divorce it in some sense or pacify it or modernize it to their own ideas and conceptions. I suspect that probably took place. But even the Bible itself, if you took the canon, does suggest the idea in Acts, for example. First, it was this little pack of communistic Jews that were taking care of each other. And then God has these miracles happen, and Peter's shocked when they're speaking in tongues. It's like, Cornelius, what the heck? They are even dumbfounded at the idea that this is going out beyond Jewish people.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's that's fiction, but that doesn't mean there's no historical relevancy to that idea.
No, I agree. And early Christians were extraordinarily entrepreneurial. The early adoption of anti-Semitism as a trope. You mentioned John's Gospel, that John does have these recurrent ideas that, the Jews are faithless kind of people who don't accept the truth of God, even though they've got it in their own holy scriptures as a prophecy and all that sort of stuff. That is breathing the air of the late first century, because the Romans, of course, go to war with the Jews after the Jewish rebellion in the 60s, and they trash Jerusalem, they trash the temple, and the Jews become the big, bogey figure in the Roman imagination from 70 or so onwards. And the Romans are celebrating the victory over they have a really bad year, the Romans, in 69, when they have 4 emperors in a row. And to re-establish the dynasty after this era, they need a big victory. So they use the victory over the Jews and the destruction of Jerusalem as their sort of symbolic, regeneration of the Roman state and Roman military cohesion and all that. So, the Christian adoption of anti-Semitism is, it's awful, but it's also strategically, it was a canny move, because it allowed Christians to, perhaps not in everyone's eyes, but in most people's eyes, successfully uncouple themselves from the Jewish roots, and to package Christianity as something that was actually much more congenial to the Roman Empire as a whole. And they used, they exploited the fact that the Roman Empire was interconnected by roads and by postal networks and so forth, to create these sort of vast international cellular networks, sending letters to each other, communicating with each other across huge amounts of space. I mean, it was a terribly modern, terribly adaptive, and, as I say, entrepreneurial religion.
So if Darwin were to express what Christianity is, knowing what we know, he might say something like the, survival of the fittest. It isn't the strongest that wins and survives. It's the one that's willing to change the most that is. And Christianity was so successful because it was so willing to adapt to whatever its current political, religious context in the culture was. It would put red mask it is. Everybody put a red mask on. You know what I mean? Everyone is just going to adapt the concept and allow it somehow to fit within that thing. So Christianity was really good at evolving. I guess it was. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also had the advantage of having, in due course, the canon of Gospels that allowed it to believe itself to be anchored in the first century as well. So even as it was changing, it could point to the fact that we're still cleaving to the same traditional canon of text. So that disguises the effect of change by saying, we are fundamentally conservative and true to the message of Jesus.
You just dropped so many nuclear bombs.
Right.
So, okay. Henotheistic trend. We've got a few more things here. The henotheistic trend towards monotheism. There was an early trend for polytheistic pantheons of gods to be viewed as multiple aspects of the same supreme god, and other lower level deities would then be demoted to divine agents like angels or subordinate divinities. So it seems like even strict monotheisms were still, in a sense, polytheistic. It seems like paganism was developing independently towards the same kind of system we find in Christianity. So when Christianity emerged, it just co-opted a lot of the existing features of paganism. For example, the Neoplatonism of Plotinus seems to have a lot in common with Christianity, such as merger of concepts like the one and the good, quotations, these are Greek terms. Can you elaborate on the transition between the classical theism and the pagan Greco-Roman world and the 3 great monotheisms of today? So that's a lot.
Yeah. How long have we got? So henotheism, as you rightly say, is it's a modern word that's used to describe a feature of polytheistic religions when they seem to show a tendency towards having one god. And this might mean that you've got one top god and lots of subordinate gods who, as you say, over time might be demoted to the status of angels or lesser deities. It might also mean that you've got, you mentioned Stoicism earlier, the sort of philosophical system that basically thinks of the world as animated by a single divine force that has multiple aspects. So the Olympian gods, Zeus, Hera, and so forth, might be aspects of this one god. Now, you're absolutely right that these ideas emerge in the Greek world, and when they emerge quite early, actually, they emerge from the 6th century onwards. We've got people saying there is one god who's the top god. I think they're particularly, they gain root in the age of empire for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that once you've got a large dispersed empire with a sort of symbolic center, then you've got a world which is much more congenial to the idea of a single organizing principle. So that religion becomes a sort of metaphor for politics, if you like, in that kind of world. Now, Christianity is, it's often been said, not a complete monotheism, because however you spin it, I mean, I know there are Christological complexities that I'm not fully in control of here, but there are 3 aspects to God, and there are, as you say, angels, and there's the devil as well. Where does the devil fit into this? Is the devil a deity? He's clearly immortal at some level, but not normally thought of it as a god. So, I mean, there is a sort of polytheistic aspect to Christianity. So, again, if you squint at it, then Christianity can sometimes look like one of these henotheistic polytheisms.
And let me ask you this. This is interesting because in the Socrates trial, when he was accused, he mentioned something about the Godhead, something to do with the Godhead. And I suspect that term, I'm very ignorant on this term and understanding its roots, but Christians adopt the idea of a Godhead Trinity idea. Do you think that this is borrowed from Greco-Roman world?
Well, I think what Socrates is talking about is something slightly different. He
Right.
thinks Socrates is a bit of a strange character. He thinks that he's got his own personal deity. This is, I mean, a former colleague of mine once argued in an academic article that Socrates was rightly killed by the Athenian people, and he deserved execution.
Wow.
And you get that sense that he just was a very strange individual who held some very strange beliefs. But yeah, so he thought he had a personal hotline to his godhead, his daimonion is the word. That's a very unusual idea in any religion, let alone Greek religion. But your question was really about whether Christian conceptions of divinity were conducted in dialogue with Greco-Roman ones. And I think, yeah, the answer, absolutely right, yes. So from the 2nd century onwards, as I mentioned, Christians increasingly engage with Greek philosophical ideas and use Plato and Aristotle as resources to try and sort out the problems of systematic theology. And the conceptions of divinity that emerged as a result of this, when people start debating about whether Christ and the Father and the Son are the same being, or whether they're sort of different, and all that sort of stuff. These are all trying to make Christian belief compatible with Greco-Roman philosophical ideas.
Wow. Well put. Thank you. And last thing on the sheet, and then I've got to ask you one good one. All right, and then I'll let you go. But I'll let you go, right? Because I don't want to let you go. I really, really don't. I really enjoyed this interview. I ask everyone right now, please, if you've gotten this far, get the book. Not only does it help my guest understand that, hey, I like Myth Vision, and it's worth coming back on Myth Vision to share this information, to teach the general public, to inform people this knowledge and this information, but like, it's good to know this stuff no matter what. And he really wrote a really good book. And if you're not like a deep physical book reader, the guy reading it on Audible does fantastic. So you guys can get it on Audible for like a credit. If you have Audible, if you don't know about audio by now, the Audible thing now, you really need to get in the 21st century, because I'll drive a car and listen to your book for hours and just soak in these ideas. And there's so much, and I know you're just scratching the surface. Really, you go deep, don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is there's so much, it's impossible. Yeah, and you do so good. So the last question on Stephen's list here, the definition of atheist. Christians love doing this. Like, you know, they want to argue definitions. I've seen debates and it frustrates the living daylights out of me. The whole debate's about a definition we can't even get past. So in the never-ending debate over the definition of atheism, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is often cited for its article called Atheism and Agnosticism. We don't have to weigh in on this if you are not interested, but I'd like your feedback on the particular claim made in this article. The A in atheism must be understood as negation instead of absence, as not instead of without. Therefore, in philosophy at least, atheism should be construed as the proposition that God does not exist, or more broadly, the proposition that there are no gods. The author seems to be making a bold claim here about how this word must be understood, based on some intrinsic property of Greek semantics. Based on your own expertise as a scholar of Greek, do you concur with this statement about how this term must be understood in modern times? And do you think this distinction would have been at all relevant in ancient times?
So on the first question, no, I don't. I don't think that the original etymological meaning in Greek should determine what we understand the modern term to be today. And this goes back to the point that your clip was, the person on your clip was making. My own, the definition of atheism that I've found most useful is one by Julian Baggini in his very short, very short introduction to atheism. That's the name of the book. And he says that essentially, if we think of atheism as a philosophical belief that there are no gods, we not only set the bar too high, but we also we make it into a kind of faith, a profession of faith, because it is asking us to answer questions that we simply cannot answer. What Baggini says is that atheism is best understood as a form of living your life without reference to divinity. So if you act, if your existence and your ethics and your day-to-day interactions with people are not governed by particular religious beliefs or beliefs in supernatural agency, then you are an atheist. So that sets the bar quite a lot lower. And it also blurs the difference between atheism and agnosticism. I think, even Dawkins or someone would say, I think he has said that, if there were a scientific way of proving the existence of gods, then of course he would believe in the existence of gods, because he is first and foremost a scientist, and scientists follow evidence and argument and the like. And I think that's the only honest position to adopt, really, ultimately, is that, if proof came along, then, you'd have to accept that.
Right.
If that proof comes along, one lives one's life using the resources that one has to hand in this world, in the here and now, or whatever. And that's how I see atheism.
So, I'm sorry. Say that again.
There was another question you had, but we can come back to that.
Yeah. Do you think the distinction would have been at all relevant in ancient times?
The distinction between atheism and agnosticism, was that?
Yeah, the idea that we're not sure, there may not, we don't know, versus, there's no gods. I mean, I don't believe in gods.
Yeah, I think that most of the discussion in ancient atheism, as I would call it, is really about the question of proof and evidence, and whether there is evidence for the existence of gods, and whether you can find argumentative strategies that philosophically prove that gods exist or don't. So it's relatively rare that you find people saying, I believe that gods don't exist, or I don't think that gods exist. Some people do that, but more often the debate is conducted at the level of agnosticism. So it's basically a negative view attacking those who would, claim that there is evidence for the existence of God.
Okay.
So, for example, people who claim that they were on a ship and the ship went down and they prayed and then they survived or whatever, and then someone will say, no, that there are lots of people that drowned and they were praying as well, so therefore it can't be the prayer that saves you, and that sort of thing.
That sounds like the 21st century.
Right.
It's like it doesn't stop, man. That sounds like what we do today, and that happens all the time, you know. Do you label yourself agnostic or atheist, and why?
I label myself, I've never been asked this question before. I don't think I would label myself an atheist because I follow that definition that Bajini advanced, which I mentioned earlier, which is to say, my life is not built around belief in the existence of God.
And I definitely concur on that myself. Of course, I have no good reason at this point when I find naturalism a very plausible explanation for things. So doesn't mean there may not be some mind out there, but we put agency into everything. So how can we know, there's agency beyond us without evidence to prove? And I'm open-minded to there being, but does that make me an agnostic? Do I have to force myself into the definition of agnostic since I don't know with certainty that there isn't something divine beyond, or the metaphysical being that potentially started all things? You know what I mean? Or everything always existed and there's a metaphysical something beyond that, just that's always kept things going. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like there's always ways to think of it. So
I mean, the reason I resist the language of agnosticism is because it just sounds wimpy, doesn't it? It sounds like it's halfway house sort of fence sitting. Oh, I'm not really sure, whatever.
Yeah, I think the splitting hairs is purposeful, oftentimes for apologetic reasons to try and, pin you in the corner. So my final question, and this is actually shifting topics back to the idea of like the fusion of cultures and things. There is an author who is in the Copenhagen school. His name's Russell Gamirkin. He has an interesting hypothesis. I don't know if you've ever, or theory, if you will. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Have you heard?
No, yes and no.
Yeah, I'd love to get you acquainted, just because you are an expert in classicist ideas of the Greek world. His theory, and I know it's very difficult for people to swallow, you have maximalist and you have minimalist in Hebrew Bible. How old is the Old Testament? How old is it old? And some people go, well, based on the documentary hypothesis, 900 BC, approximately is when we have some of our oldest priestly text or whatnot, down to 500 BC in some range in that area. Thomas L. Thompson, who's a scholar in this field, brought Russell Gamirkin in and had the book published by the Copenhagen School. His book is called Berosus and Genesis, Manetho and Exodus, and Dating the Pentateuch is pretty much what the book's about. And his hypothesis I find so interesting is that pretty much the Alexandrian library bolstered Berosus and Manetho's manuscripts, having the Jews, when they came to translate the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, around this period and this time, he looks at references done by some of these Greek authors that are actually trying to explain what the Jews, they mention the Jews in their writings, and they say they had a guy named Moses, but it does not describe him anything like what we have in the stories of the Bible. So he, he starts with minimalism rather than maximalism. He divorces historiography as evidence to say, the story says that Daniel was written sometime 70 years after Jeremiah, but we have internal evidence. We can show Daniel was definitely most likely 2nd century BC. So he starts with, we have good reasons to doubt it's as old as they say. He starts with minimalism and works backwards instead of maximalism and works forward. And what he did is he says that the Greek world and the Hellenism, these authors, Berosus, Manetho, helped influence these Jewish scribes to create the Pentateuch. So technically what we have is a very late in the game Pentateuch rather than an early documentary hypothesis. And that's being fair because, you go to an Orthodox Jew, Moses wrote the 5 books. I'm not even bringing that into this account. I'm talking documentary hypothesis. He's challenging that. And he's saying, no, this is a Hellenistic creation using sources like Berosus, Manetho, creating their own narrative and borrowing from Plato. The argument he has is that Plato's idea of a nation, you want to create a nation that goes way back into antiquity because that proves somehow your God is divine and your laws come from antiquity, pre-antediluvian, the whole nine. and create your story like that so that your nation will be an eternal nation, the idea that it will last. And he gave great ideas of this. And according to him, he has evidence that Plato was used, and some of these Greek writings were used in the Hebrew Bible. I know this has to pique your interest, even if you're skeptical. I love this because I would love to get your thoughts. Do you think that's possible? And that's of course you being someone who hasn't read it. Do you think it's possible?
Yes, exactly. And also not a scholar of Judaism or Israelite stuff in general. So yeah, I mean, obviously, no, I can't comment without having read the book and without knowing the field.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it is clear, isn't it, that the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text of the Hebrew Bible, is younger than the Septuagint. So, we don't have anything older than the Septuagint as evidence for what Jews, Israelites believed. Nevertheless, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me, I don't know. All of this is politicized, isn't it? Ultimately, it's about trying to. I mean, the people that want the Hebrew Bible to be old and to be, people that want to find bricks with David was here in Jerusalem. That's a sort of a religious nationalist project designed to sort of shore up the legitimacy of the Bible and biblical worldviews. People who want to downdate it and say that it's all Hellenistic. That is itself a sort of political act as well. So I don't know. I mean, I find these. I mean, I find it absolutely fascinating, but I find these sort of big story, sort of balloon puncturing narratives suspect.
I'd like,
political, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, no, I totally respect what you're saying, and I'd be interested in, of course, getting your thoughts as you further to investigate it, if you ever even take the time to. I mean, you have so much Greek in your mind that it's like, that's why I'm so glad that you as a classicist came on and we're able to discuss these things and really break down these ideas for us and listen to those clips, give us your comments, because from what I understand, I don't know Steve McRae. I have nothing at all against any of these guys. In fact, I've never even talked to him. I know he recently joined my Facebook group and there was a poll given where it said, what do you classify yourself as? Atheist, agnostic, theist, and other or something, and probably pantheist, you name it. But, I checked off the atheist box just because I don't believe in gods. I don't believe there is a God. It doesn't mean there isn't potentially one. But it had so many comments from them debating right after he posted it, and he's splitting hairs on the language and the words and the philosophical atheism and, these positions. You better affirm that there is no God, but how do you know that there's, and just, it never ends, these ideas. And,
as I said earlier, I mean, that sort of hair-splitting tactic is ultimately, I think, deliberately an attempt to try and sabotage a more sort of interesting discussion. Because, if you never get beyond these definitions of whether you're an atheist or agnostic or whatever, I mean, that's really ultimately pretty trivial stuff.
Thank you so much for saying that. And look, ladies and gentlemen, Tim Whitmarsh, Professor Tim Whitmarsh, thank you so much for joining me on Myth Vision today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a lot of fun.
I'd love to do this again. I mean that. I'm sincerely want to do more and promote this book even more. I think more people need to get out their swords and shields and start battling the gods yourselves, okay? I would like to have you guys check out the book and tell me what you think. This was such a great book. I really, really recommend this. You guys see it on the screen. Obviously, go down in the description. Get you a copy. Go on Audible. It's on Amazon. It's really, really a good read. And it'll open up a world, if you're not familiar with it like I wasn't, that I've never known and really started to fall in love with as I read this book. So well written. And thank you so much once again for joining us. Let's do this again, sir.
Thanks, Derek.
Thank you. And don't ever forget, we are Myth Vision.